This is a really important point. Vladimir Putin, he says all sorts of things. His intended audience is a local audience. The things he says are often designed to calm the people who are in opposition to the war, people who are starting to have second thoughts about whether this war is a good idea. So this idea of him saying that no further strikes were necessary, it was obviously never going to be something that he stuck to. It was just something that he said for the local audience.
Yeah. What seems to have been very damaging over the last 2 days have been these kamikaze Iranian missiles, drones, should I say. Now, the UN has said that these drones breach the nuclear deal. Not surprisingly, both Iran and Russia, they're denying any knowledge of their use.
Indeed, and this is something that the US is starting to crack down on. So, of course, the Iran nuclear deal was something that was struck back in 2015. The US under Donald Trump exited that deal, and currently there are talks in place to try to return to that deal on the table. But the Iranians have said all sorts of things and have done all sorts of things in contravention of the deal. One of those things is that they have been selling their Shahed drones to the Russians. The Russians, the fact that they're using this drone, this type of drone, we know that that probably is an indication of the fact that they're running low on their more powerful weapons and on the weapons that are more precise in their strikes. But these drones have proven really very problematic and very dangerous to the Ukrainians. This morning, I'm in Europe at the moment, this morning our time, your evening in Australia, we've seen a renewed barrage of these drones that have taken out what President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said is roughly 1/3 of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That's very problematic because, of course, it's turning cold in Europe. They're going into winter. Ukraine is bitterly cold. And what I'm hearing on the ground is one of my colleagues who is in Kyiv, for the first time during this war, he has actually lost all energy at his apartment in central Kyiv. That's a really, really significant escalation of those attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Yes, because these drones seem to be so much more precise. You know, the air systems, air defence systems that some nations in Europe promised Ukraine just last week. Will they be effective against these drones? How soon will they make their way to Ukraine?
The difficulty is with these drones, you can send out multiple drones, they're slow moving, but there are a lot of them. And so having to cover the skies across all of Ukraine, which is a very large country, is a difficult task. So we know the Ukrainians, the more air defenses they have, the more they'll be able to prevent these strikes. And certainly places like Kyiv will likely be more protected because that's going to be a priority area for the Ukrainians. But what we also know is that a lot of this material, a lot of this kit that the Ukrainians have been asking for, much of it has been promised, but it has been delayed in terms of deliveries. And that's partly because the US and Europe can't seem to quite decide who has what, who can send what. We're hearing from the Germans, for instance, that they're running out of the things that the Ukrainians have been requesting. So that's part of the issue, locating where these air defenses are and getting it into Ukrainian hands in time to stop these attacks. And of course, in the meantime, every day we're getting these barrages on civilian areas in Ukraine, and we're seeing people dying in their homes at night as a result of these bombardments.
Yeah. How likely is it now we're hearing about sort of mobilization in Belarus? How likely is it that Belarus will start playing a larger part in this war?
So this is an interesting question. Belarus is the staging ground for Russian attacks on the northern part of Ukraine. And certainly it's really important from that perspective because it allows the Russians to have their troops closer to the close to the Ukraine border. It allows them to have their equipment close to the Ukraine border. In terms of whether Belarusian troops will actually enter the war, that I think what we're seeing is quite unlikely. And the reason for that is basically because the situation in Belarus is very volatile. I spoke with Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, who is the exiled opposition leader who essentially won the 2020 election against Alexander Lukashenko, who's a dictator, but was actually forced to flee because of the brutal crackdown on protests. I spoke with her last week in Brussels, where she has been campaigning for assistance for Belarus, and her theory, and I think this is a theory that seems quite realistic, is that Lukashenko's grip on the military is not sufficient to actually guarantee that if he did give his troops the order to enter Ukrainian territory, that they would actually carry out those orders. And there is this, the opposition has been getting all sorts of tip-offs from people who are actually in the Belarusian army, who are stationed at the border with Russian troops, telling them where these troops are, telling them what equipment they have. So there is this real feeling that if Lukashenko gave the order, what we could actually see is the troops cross the border into Ukraine and defect, hide, run away, but not fight with the Russians, because that's really just, Lukashenko just doesn't seem to have a grip on his troops in the way that Putin does.
Indeed. Putin too says that the troop mobilisation is almost complete, and that will be the end of it, presuming that they will be now ready to go to the front lines. What effect are we likely to see, and what do we know about just how well trained these new troops might be?
I think, again, the thing to remember is that Putin saying that the mobilization is almost complete actually isn't an indication of the fact that the mobilization is almost complete. It's an indication of the fact that he needs Russians to think the mobilization is almost complete. And the reason for that is because this has been extremely unpopular at home. So the Russians were willing to stomach the invasion. They were willing to stomach 6 months of bombings. But when you start threatening people's family, when you start calling up people who are entirely unprepared to go to war, which is the case with Russia's mobilization, now we're seeing people take to the streets in protest. And that's something Putin cannot stomach, and that's something that he's trying to quash with these statements saying that they're going to complete the mobilization in the next 2 weeks. In terms of the impact of these troops on the war, what we're seeing is that they are extremely poorly supplied, they are untrained, they are unprepared, and morale is very low. So the impact of just throwing people who've been in these training camps for a few days onto the front line, I think that is not going to be a particularly effective method to turn the tide of the war for Putin. But that's why I think it's also quite unlikely that the mobilization is truly complete. I think that Putin will use the winter to essentially rebuild the number of men in his army so that he may be able to have a renewed offensive once the weather turns better again in the spring.
Yeah. Zoya, so many different issues at play here. Good to have you on. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.